Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on the NRCS Conservation Practices, Organic Management, and Soil Health by Susan Andrews of the NRCS and Michelle Wander and Carmen Ugarte of the University of Illinois. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. This presentation is also being recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording on our website and on the eOrganic YouTube channel within the coming week. There, you can also find a webinar on the NRCS Equip Technical and Financial Support Program presented last year by Sarah Brown, who will be joining us for the question and answer period today. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this week's presentation. Dr. Susan Andrews is the national leader of the NRCS Soil Quality and Ecosystems Program, and she is speaking with us from Lincoln, Nebraska. Dr. Michelle Wander is a professor of soil fertility and ecology at the University of Illinois, and Dr. Carmen Ugarte is a research scientist in soil ecology, also at the University of Illinois. After the presentation, which will last about 45 minutes, we'll have an additional 30 minutes for questions from the audience. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If you don't see the question box, just click the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. I'll be reading the questions out loud and we'll answer as many as we have time for in the 30 minutes. So before we turn this over to our speakers, they asked me to just run a very quick poll, which will last about 20 seconds or so, if you could check off your primary job category. The little quick poll has popped up on the screen and it'll be on for only about 20 seconds or so. So if you could just click one of those options, I know we certainly haven't covered everyone, then the speakers will have a little bit of an idea of who they're speaking to today and can tailor the presentation. So I'm going to close that now. And I'm going to just broadcast the results there so we can see who's on the webinar. And with that, we'll turn things over in just a moment to Susan Andrews, our first speaker. So Susan, you should now have the screen control. So if you just click on once on that screen again, you'll be able to advance the slides.
Good afternoon. This is Susan. I am not getting I'm still on the poll. Oh, good. Here we are.
Okay.
Things are going well. All right. So I'm Susan Andrews, and I am with NRCS, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the new Soil Health Initiative that we have rolled out recently and its relationship to organic systems. And one of the things that we'll be talking about is how well it relates, and it's important to note that, well, my slides aren't advancing.
Okay, let me move that for you.
Okay. Important to note that right now this is primarily a public relations and educational campaign, and so there's no money attached with this, and although it doesn't
muted
all systems, there are still plans to expand. Right now it's only in cropping systems, and I'd say it doesn't cover all cropping systems, but they're also planning to expand to range and forestry. And it does
unmuted
on this soil health management system. So they're trying to take a systems approach, and it is looking very much like that sort of whole farm planning. If you have worked with NRC
muted
past, that was a thing we did quite a while back. It was announced in Ohio on a farm with, it's quite the PR event. You might have read about it back in August. And the the primary people that are working on this are trainers and public affairs specialists. And it is falling to folks like me to try to make sure all the science is aligned. I am still having trouble getting this to advance. Oh, here I can do it. I can do it that way, maybe. Okay.
Unmuted.
There are plans to make a soil health division, not under soils, interestingly enough, but under the science and technology deputy area. It speaks a lot to our chief's dedication to this idea of soil health, to try to do something this bold in the kind of budget climate that we have right now. So you can tell that there is quite a bit of dedication there. We do have an acting division director who is Kevin Brown, and he is the state con from Tennessee. So if there's anybody on from Tennessee, you probably have an acting state conservationist there. They plan to have 8 regional trainers, and the group in Greensboro that is primarily responsible for soil health training is going to morph into a soil health center. And again, these are all plans, and I assume that they're going to be, subject to budgetary limitations, but that is the plan. Okay, I'm going to do this the hard way, but I think it's going to work. And I should say that most first slides that I'm showing you are from the chief's talk to the state cons when he was first rolling this out, and it was developed by public affairs specialists. That's why it looks so nice. I can't take credit for all of that, but this one here in particular I thought was interesting for you all to take a look at. Again, this was selling the idea of a soil health initiative to state cons. So the chief was telling this group that it is taking advantage of our strengths, our soils, and management. That's the combination there that creates soil quality. I'd also add ecology, being an ecologist, I guess. This idea of a growing market need, there is some talk that perhaps this would parlay into a green payment, or using markets, kind of like it's a sustainability premium, much like there's an organic premium. If you're using sustainable practices, perhaps you could then have a premium on your prices with a green label. This return on the nation's conservation investment is really, talking about, Farm Bill programs. But I think the other piece of that is also for farmers to think of the return on their conservation investment, because soil building doesn't happen overnight. So you really need to realize that that there is a return on the investment, but you need to think of it as a long-term investment. And I think, and it's nothing new, but it is important to realize that if someone has a tenuous land lease, then that can be an issue to investing in soil building or soil health. And these benefits are real and can be seen in the literature and in real life. Let's see if we can make this happen. Yes, and so some of the benefits that you can see are increasing soil carbon, which in and of itself may not sound that exciting, but the links to organic matter, and those of you who are organic growers probably know this very well. The links between organic matter and soil functions are very important. You can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You can reduce your input costs to save field passes. When you increase organic matter, you also increase water holding capacity and increase the resistance to drought effects. And a little secondarily, if you hold your soil in place, you're improving water and air quality. And when you have organic matter, you're benefiting the soil food web, because that's the primary food source. And when you have a balanced food web, you tend to reduce disease and soil pests. These benefits also move up, they scale up. It's not only on your farm, but downstream, and looking at the watershed level, you can see the effects of water erosion into our waterways. And this is also important in areas where wind erosion is prominent, because you can by reducing wind erosion, you can reduce health effects and property damage. The campaign is focusing on farmers that are what being called soil health farmers, and so there's a number of case studies that are being produced in sort of brochure or fact sheet form. Most of these, no, I have to say, all of these are no-till farmers. And they're getting, great results with their systems, and they are around the U.S., but it is, primarily the same system. And again, they are going with this soil health management system. They've got 4 guiding principles that are listed here. It's diversity, increased diversity, reduced disturbance, and I think you could probably stop right there. Growing a living root year-round is, somewhat regional, because it becomes a problem when you get in the northern latitudes, but it is part of both disturbance and diversity, because if at a minimum you leave the root in place, it's been shown that the bulk of the carbon that comes from a plant and goes into the soil comes from the plant roots. So leaving those roots undisturbed as long as possible, whether they're living or not, is very important. And then keep the soil covered. Again, I would put that under the disturbance category. But there's it is a fine list. Here is a list of practices that have been put together, and these are the national practice standards, is what these numbers refer to, that are used by NRCS. And once it's a practice standard, this is not the only reason why they are standards, but they can then be used for cost share and other programs. And so that's one use of this these standards. But if you see here, the 5 mandatory practices, they are fine practices, but it's not going to fit everybody. And I personally would argue, I personally would like to see a little bit more mixing and matching offered, but this is a, the first attempt, and I think it's a decent first attempt. So if we get back to this idea of disturbance and diversity, this is sort of the way I've been thinking about it as an ecologist. There are really three main kinds of disturbance, and then you have the three types of disturbance, but also frequency and intensity of disturbance is very important too. But I'm not going to talk too much about that. But physical disturbance, we're talking about tillage or compaction. Biological would be compared with the natural state of monoculture as a huge disturbance. And chemical, not only pesticides but fertilizers are types of disturbances, and they. Oops. I've got. Let's see what happens here. I've got some animation. Okay. I'm going to have to hit this a bunch of times. I'm sorry about this. I wish my forward arrow was working. So I've got strategy, management strategies, minimizing tillage. It could be just depth of tillage. If you are using tillage for weed control, cultivation is probably the typical thing that you do. But if you think about the intensity of it, you comparing a cultivation with a moldboard plow disturbance, there's a huge difference, and how many times, that frequency also makes a difference. And then with the biological, we're talking about increasing diversity of plants. And once you're doing that, then you're also, depending on the plants, if you could use trap crops at the edge of fields that pull the pest organisms away, or attractant crops that bring in insect predators. Many different things you can do, and there's many types of diversity. It's not just cover crops. You can be doing intercropping, so you have diversity in the field at the same time. And if you think of the food web, the organisms in the soil, they're just. I like to use analogies to people a lot, where you're going to be healthier when you have a diverse diet than if you're just eating from the exudates from one kind of root. I went back and forth between people and microbes. Sorry about that. And then with chemical, as I mentioned, you've got the pesticide use and precision application, and this applies to the organic pesticides and fertilizers as well. They, of course, aren't as disturbing, but they still constitute a disturbance compared with the natural state. Sorry about this delay. Here we go. So this is where I'm going to hit you up with theory. It is ecological theory, and you can see down here at the bottom that it was first put forth in 1978 by Connell, and it was he was looking at intertidal zones and mollusks. And it's since been found to hold true in tropical rainforests, in coral reefs, and a number of us have also applied it to agricultural systems. So what we're looking at here is this horizontal or x-axis is looking at the disturbance frequency or intensity. And on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, we're looking at diversity. And what this curve is showing you is that at the intermediate level of disturbance, you find the highest amount of diversity. Now, at high disturbance, that's kind of obvious. We're when you got a lot, you're being hit with a lot of pesticides, tillage. It's a or tillage, then you tend to have less diversity, and or in the on a coastal area in the natural mangrove or something like that, you can think of hurricanes, and then you reduce diversity. On the other side here, this is a little less. It's definitely less intuitive, and this is where your competitively dominant organisms take over, and you have less diversity. So think of a weed coming in, or seeds from the last crop coming in, and so you have and they dominate, and your crop doesn't do as well. And in general, a monoculture would be would come on this end of things. So let's go. So here, when we talk about diversity, what follows is also function. So each of these organisms that make a diverse population, they have different niches or do different things. If you have a lot of diversity, then you have many functions happening. And then when we apply this to the agricultural system, you have a moldboard plow. You have a lot of disturbance, high intensity, and that means you have less function, less diversity. You reduce the disturbance by, reducing the frequency or intensity. You have a healthier ecosystem, more diversity, more function. And this is not just true of the physical disturbance. It's also true for chemical disturbance, and there with the picture is pesticide applications. And then on the other end is the monoculture, and when you add diversity, then you again add plant diversity. You're also adding biological diversity in the soil and increasing soil functions and thereby soil health. So really the take-home here is there are many paths to increasing soil health. There's not just one soil health management system.
Unmuted.
It's hard to drive this home in many sectors, but this is straight application of ecological theory, and hopefully it wasn't too cumbersome. Here's another, just an example for those who graze. Intermediate disturbance actually has been found to give you the highest levels of soil carbon. When you have too much grazing, then you kill off the plants. When you don't have enough, you actually don't have, as the plants aren't stimulated to exude carbon out of their roots. Because these grasslands evolved with ungulates like these buffalo feeding on them. So that's another example. So that's the end of my section, and if there's one thing to take home is there's more than one path to soil health. Thank you. And
Okay.
take away, Carmen.
Okay, Carmen, I'm going to give you control of the screen. So you should have it now when you just click once on the screen.
Good afternoon. And in this section, we are going to report on a project that we had working with Hoyan Kwon and Susan Andrews also. So in the first part, I will talk about the conservation measurement tool, or CMT, and the approach that we took for evaluating the questions that are asked using data mining and meta-analysis. And then I am going to turn on to Michelle, so she will be talking about the modeling framework that we came up with. So the conservation measurement tool is part of the Conservation Stewardship Program, which came to be after the passing of the 2008 Farm Bill, and it encourages producers to adopt conservation practices or to improve the existing ones. It also offers, since it's a voluntary payment, it offers payments, voluntary enrollment, I would say, offers payments for producers who are willing to enroll in the program. And how this is, how NRCS is evaluating for enrollment is through the use of the conservation measurement tool, which is an ambitious tool that measures several ecosystem services, and it ends up with evaluation of what we call the conservation performance. So both we think that the way the Farm Bill specifies the implementation or the development of tools that would evaluate the effectiveness of these conservation practices has changed broadly the way that conservation programs have worked in the country. And also because it includes a series of ecosystem services like soil quality, air quality, biodiversity, and habitat for the wildlife, and so on. It encompasses a greater scope in terms of ecosystem services. So how the programs in NRCS work, basically they have three components. There is management practices on one end here, and then we have ecosystem services, or what NRCS labels them as macro concerns, on the other end. So how can we measure, how can we relate these ecosystem services back to the management practices are through using indicators so that are readily quantifiable and measurable in the field conditions. So here we have all the ecosystem services and the use of energy that are considered in the CMT. And these services have been broken down into 27 micro concerns or indicators. And for specifically talking about soil quality and soil erosion, we have 4 indicators: the level of organic matter in the soil, salinity, nutrient cycling, and compaction. They are very closely related. And like from the rest of this section, I'll be talking more specifically into the evaluation of soil organic matter. So the tool, this is the typical questions that the CMT uses to evaluate conservation performance. So it asks for a series of description on the rotation practices. It also asks for the type of species that are included in the rotation, as you could see here. And many of these questions are like include the number of years in the rotation or the number of species, but there is also several questions that are a yes and no type of answer. So this is how the tool looks in the background. So you have here the set of questions that are being asked, and then you have here the micro concerns. On top, you have the macro concerns to which the micro concerns are being referred to. So like in this example, we have sheet with real and wind erosion that correspond to the soil erosion macro concern. And each one of the questions have a weight. So depending on the impact on this specific macro concern, you have neutral weights, you have negative weights, and you have also positive weights. So the rank or the weighting goes from -5 to +5.
Now, we were talking about where to put the layout. Can you talk to Jake how to do that?
So in this next slide, what I have is a summary of some of the questions that are in CMT that could be found in the literature for the soil erosion and the soil quality macro concerns. Again, here on top, you have the descriptions of the rotation with the type of species and the number of crops that are being harvested, the frequency of use of cover crops in the rotation. Down here, we have the use on the residue and the approaches to tillage, being spring tillage or fall tillage, and the depth. And also we have at the very bottom, we have the questions that relate to the use of fertility practices. So you get a score for using any sort of fertility practices, and then you have also an additional score for using organic fertility practices. So what our approach to evaluate these practices was through the use of data mining and meta-analysis, which is basically taking or doing an experiment with the literature. So we ended up collecting data based on a criteria that we wanted to look at publications that were addressing a similar question, which in this case was the effect of management practices on soil organic matter or soil organic carbon. We also try to avoid publication bias by looking at a variety of series of publications from different groups. We looked at the independence of studies. You're aware that we have been doing research on soil organic matter for many years. So in many cases, there are multiple publications that come out of the same study. So we did, to avoid using the same study several times, we took in this case, we took the most recent report for that site. We also looked at the field layout and replications. This is a very important step or an important aspect that we need to look into data mining, because we need to be aware of the number of replicates in a given study. We also looked for controls. In this specific case, we were looking at the effect of, like I said, the use of management practices, and we compared everything to the conventional practices that were in place in a specific region. So then we also looked at the sampling methods and the depth. Many groups have different approaches to sampling, so we ended up breaking up our data into 4 categories. data that was collected looking at the 0 to 10 centimeters depth, 0 to 15, 0 to 20, and 0 to 30. We also looked at the statistics that were being reported. Part of this, the use of meta-analysis, depends on reports on a mean and a standard deviation, or an indicator or a statistic that could be translated into back into a standard deviation, like a standard error or a coefficient of variation, for example. So in this case, we were very ambitious and thought that we could collect all that data from the literature. However, we ended up with probably less than 5% of our database that had reports on a measure of variability. So we resolved to do an unweighted meta-analysis, which is assuming that all the studies or all the data points have the same the same standard deviation. So in this case, we have the model of NRCS, how we relate all this back to the program model. So we have practices. So we start with tillage, nitrogen source, and the rotation length, and we were looking at the their effects on soil organic carbon, and the final outcome would be to evaluate the effects of the practices on soil quality. So when we ended up with a database of conventional practices, the effect of conventional practices on soil carbon, and the effect of the enhancements or the new alternative management practices. So we ended up creating or evaluating this data using this effect response ratio, which is basically a ratio between the alternative practices, like I said before, divided by the control practices for that specific region. And we did some statistical analysis looking at this new created variable called the response ratio. And we assessed its significance by using resampling techniques that allowed us to compute confidence intervals, and we evaluated the significance of these practices by looking at whether the confidence intervals were overlapping or not, and we'll see that in greater detail in the following slide. So in here, I selected in red all the practices that we were able to mine in the literature. So you have them in red, the rotation characteristics, the frequency of using cover crops in the rotation, the species that were included in the rotation, the type of tillage, the application and source of fertilizer or fertility sources. For each category, we had to define a control. So in this specific case, we started from the broader keywords that could encompass these management practices. So we ended up searching in the literature for the effect of cropping systems on soil organic carbon and other equivalents like soil organic matter and total organic carbon. And we define our control, the conventional system, and we compared them to other studies that included the comparison of organic cropping systems, conventional cropping systems with some sort of conservation till, and the use of conventional systems with the implementation of non-till practices. When we looked at the effect of nitrogen source, we compare everything against an inorganic source, and we looked at the effect of inorganic fertilizer, the effect of inorganic fertilizer in combination with cover crops, the use of manure and cover crops, and the use of cover crops alone. When we looked at the effect of the length of the rotation, we compare that to a 1-year rotation. And most of our studies included a 2-year rotation. And the ones that were 3 years or longer included basically rotations that were between 3 and 5-year rotations. In this map, what I have is that, well, first of all, the different colors and the letters are representing the land resource regions that NRCS works with. So within each of these land resource regions, I have placed dots that indicate where our studies were coming from. And not surprisingly, most of the data came from these two regions, land resource region M and N, excuse me. And we started, so each dot represents a study which may have several pair comparisons within the dot, but what I wanted to point out in here is that we started our data mining process with over 2,000 studies, and we ended up with 55 studies that met the criteria that I described above. So suggesting that, for one thing, there is a lot of research that's being done. A lot of that is in other countries and outside of the continental U.S. that we were evaluating in this case. But there is also a lot of studies that they don't have, or they don't meet the criteria of including data on replication or including data on statistical standard deviations and things like that. So in this next slide, what I have is a plot, typical plot of how we end up looking at a meta-analysis report. So here on the x-axis, I have the 4 categories of the depth that we looked at. And then on the y-axis, I have the response ratio, which is, in this specific case, either the organic, the conservation till or non-till carbon divided by the conventional system. And this, something to point out in these first 3 depths, 0 to 10 down to 0 to 20, it's that we're seeing that these systems are equally able to improve soil carbon. So in here we see a baseline. Our conventional system would be the baseline, and that would be the 1. So everything that you see above 1 would represent an increase in carbon. So you see that all the confidence intervals in here in this particular 3 depths are overlapping each other. So that's suggesting that their abilities for increasing carbon in the systems are very similar. When we look down at the 0 to 30 centimeters, you see that the non-till confidence intervals are not overlapping with the organic confidence intervals, which end here. So that's suggesting that there is a change. You see an increase in the organic systems of about 28%. And you see, and there is no positive change in terms of using conservation till. This isn't that much of a surprise. There have been reports in the literature that suggest that the concentration of carbon with non-till systems basically is the carbon is being redistributed through the profile, and you see more increases in the surface than in deeper depths. From something in here, the increase in the 0 to 30 could be in the organic systems could be attributed to the use of a greater soil coverage and the greater use of cover crops that are scavenging for nutrients deep down in the soil profile. So how to relate these results to the CMP? What we have done in here is that we have created we have summarized here some of the characteristics that could be associated with each one of these systems. So we have here the organic, the conventional, and non-till systems. And everywhere where you see a number, you would see a possible, a rank, a weight that would be given by CMP in the case that these systems would be applying for enrollment. So you see the complexity of the organic systems. Organic systems have a higher diversity than conventional systems. Organic systems use cover crops, which is very highly rewarded. They also have usually a hay fallow phase. Although they use spring tillage, and you see the negative weight, negative score in here. You see also positive scores for the residue management, practices, and the use of organic fertility sources. In this next slide, I have separated each one of the depths. Each box here represents the depth, so 0 to 10, 0 to 15, 0 to 20, and 0 to 30. And the axes are rotated. So the y-axis here, everything to the right of the 1 would be an increase over the use of synthetic fertilizer. Not all the comparisons, not all of the fertility sources were found in all the sampling depths, such as the case of the use of fertilizer in combination with manure and cover crops, for example, which was found only in the 0 to 15 sampling depth. Something to point out here is that there is a consistent increase in carbon due to the effect of cover crops. We have here this the first dot on the top of each square or each box. Something also that we saw, it was that most of the management and the approaches to fertility increased carbon. However, the increase, it wasn't as pronounced as by the use of cover crops. Also, something that we found in here is that the rate of increase also depends on the type and source of organic amendment. In this case, we found these studies that looked at the effect of liquid manure in combination with cover crops, and they reduced carbon in the soil in approximately, I think it was around the 19–20% range. So we related this with the scorings on the CMP, and what we have is that basically there are rewards assigned for, or like positive scores given for the use of fertility practices in general, and then there is a full score for the use of organic fertility practices. And what this graph told us is basically that there are differences in terms of the sources that are being used. So we think that the CMP should include also the questions regarding the source and the quantity and the quality of fertility application. And we have here the use of cover crops, where our results are also agreeing with the way the CMP is rewarding. In terms of the length of the rotation, I rotated back the axis to the very first slide. So here we have that the 3-year rotation in general was able to increase SOC more than the 2-year rotation. what we found is like the great majority of the studies that were that had a 3-year rotation were mostly either a corn soybean rotation or a corn sorghum soybean rotation. So there have been also reports in the literature that suggest that because of the amount of residue that it's being incorporated in a 3-year rotation and the quality of the residue, it actually it's hard, or we don't see any positive increases in soil carbon. Many of our 3-year rotations included included rotations that included at least 2 years of a high biomass crop, and they are combined with a low biomass producing crop. So the 3-year rotation will inherently leave more residue in the system. So here I hypothetically looked at a 3-year rotation and a 3-year rotation for the systems in the regions of the North Central and the East, which were the regions that had the greatest number of pair comparisons. And we looked, for example, a 3-year rotation will have probably a low residue production, for example, soybean, which will be neutral or weighted as neutral. Then it would have high residue crop, which will be rewarded with a higher number. And then at the bottom, you see the score, the part of the score that would result from this rotation. And then on the far right, you have a 3-year rotation, which would have a low residue production crop, and then you would have a 2-year production of a high residue producing crop. And on top of that, you would add the effect of the higher diversity, and in some cases also the effect of use of cover crops. So the potential score for that section gets much higher, and that agrees also with what we're seeing here in the results of the meta-analysis. So to summarize this part, basically here you have on the left side we plotted, or we typed our summary for the meta-analysis, and on the right side we have a quick evaluation of how this is relating with how CMP is scoring for the use of these practices. So first we have that the use of organic systems are able to increase SOC, and in some cases to a greater extent, like you saw in the 0 to 30 centimeters depth. And that's in agreement with CMP. The use of cover crops also is in agreement with how CMP is evaluating this practice. For the use of other organic sources, like the use of manure, some of them, they do not increase SOC, especially when we look at the use of practices that apply wet manures. So we see that, and we are recommending that the CMP addresses these effects also. And finally, we looked at a positive relationship between the diversity and or the length of the rotation and soil carbon. And we think that it should reach a plateau after or in a 3-year or longer rotation. So that would probably need some modification, because the CMP would reward for rotations that would increase the potential score for rotations that are 4, 5, or 7 years long. So with that, I'm going to turn to Michelle to talk about the modeling framework. So thank you.
Unmuted.
Okay, Michelle, you might want to unmute your microphone.
I think I'm unmuted,
okay,
and hopefully
you're
you can
okay
hear me.
now.
There we go.
Okay.
It's a deadly delay. Thanks, Carmen and Susan. I wanted to, in a way, talk about the scope of the CM tool as we look up from that direct comparison with one very important indicator that is an important proxy for not only soil quality as a macro concern, but other micro concerns. It can contribute to benefits, although we don't see it listed in this breakout of the variables that are tracked in the micro concerns in these other factors, but we see some hints at other properties that we could possibly monitor or follow through a data mining approach or through some other kind of validation approach to evaluate the performance of this tool. And I think very seriously about this along with other colleagues because this CMT tool and the CSP program are very important in the sense that they directly address broad supply of ecosystem services, and the role that an agency like NRCS has played and I think will continue to play cannot be underestimated. You know, I think many others are interested in rewarding ecosystem services, and the approach and the values that NRCS places on practices and outcomes will have a huge influence because of the government role and the scope that this federal agency has. So we looked at the ability to broadly support relationships using data mining, and we use soil organic carbon as our first metric because it is such an important sort of Uber metric, and because there's a lot of data about it. So you heard from Carmen about some of the deficiencies or limits in that data, you know, disproportionate coverage nationally. Also, the majority of the studies that we included were row crop systems, and we have a lot of other kinds of cropping systems that we would like to cover and really validate and refine weightings in tools and reward services. So we might look to other methods like process models, and I think you can see my arrow there to see sort of I can direct your attention. And that can work very well for proxy measures. Oops, I didn't mean to go forward. Like soil organic matter, but we could also do that for things like erosion. When we looked at the literature to look at the utility of data mining for erosion, we weren't as encouraged as we were for soil organic matter because of variability, many fewer studies, and also fewer studies done across the broad range of lands that NRCS programs would be applied to. So we might look to Russell, and we have been looking at some of the variables. The coverage that NRCS has and the quality and intensity of data is hard to match by looking at the piecemeal literature. So we also have an opportunity, we think, with the Russell database and the detail that NRCS has about practices and soil types. So that ability to localize information using existing resources would be something that we should look to validate the performance of the soil erosion macro concern, for example. We looked at other proxy measures or things that Carmen referred to as indicators, things like phosphorus, which could be an important indicator both for soil fertility and for water quality, is a little bit difficult because of the variety of analytical methods people apply and ways that that data is reported. Some of it might be found in runoff or in eroded sediments, or some might be in standing stocks and soil surface depth. So when we really think about how to validate those relationships, we are looking more toward some of the, I think, very thoughtful work that others have done with a phosphorus index calculator. Nitrous oxide as an air quality proxy is one that we think is friendly to data mining. We've done a little bit of work, not to the degree covered by soil organic carbon, but there is a growing literature on, again, a restricted set of processes and geographically limit, it's not as full a database, but that database suffers from some of the same problems we have with organic matter, where detail about the specific time and the specific implements applied is lacking, and this is a variable where that temporal information, moisture information is vital to really understand the process. So here is another example where maybe helping expand coverage and filling gaps might be aided by use of process models. I want to get all my text up there. We used process models to try to flesh out a framework, and in a way we're literally doing this for a couple of the macro concerns, but we're also thinking and inviting the thoughts of others about how we are going to use our existing knowledge base to do something very important, which is to validate and refine decision-making tools to achieve conservation and stewardship goals. So process models are something that typically include hydrologic components that can be very site-specifically localized, and NRCS information is a key piece of that work for many relying on these kinds of tools. Most of these tools will have a crop growth component that connects up with climate and atmosphere, and then there'll be a process model that describes, for example, soil organic carbon or soil erosion, which I'll talk to you a bit more about. In our framework, we looked at Russell and Century models because these are very well-established process models for soil organic carbon and for erosion. And we applied these using the soil organic carbon piece. We actually used a surrogate Century model developed by Ho-Young Kwan and Bob Hudson that allows you to decouple the soil organic carbon submodel from crop growth and from the hydrologic model in a way that lets you really understand the relationship between the practices that we might be considering in CMT. So we developed this framework, and I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to go faster than I might have during this section. But we basically rebuild using established historical records to really calibrate the model regionally and build it inside of SAS, a submodel. And a nice part about this is that we can actually do statistical analysis and sensitivity analysis with this surrogate model. So if you're interested in that, could follow up later with more questions. We used Russell, which I know you're all those of you, I guess over half of you are affiliated with NRCS, and you know this inside and out. So this is erosion process model that considers organic matter inputs, field operations, and erosion. And it also computes a soil conditioning index that could be related to soil organic matter. We developed detailed model runs for 60 counties in 24 of the states. The red circles are the areas, again, where we have the biggest data investment, but we did actually run this across the country using remote sensing data to identify the dominant crop and cropping systems, considering NRCS practice records. And then we looked at the dominant soil types inside the counties, those 60 counties that we went to. So we basically went to the counties where we had meta-analysis data in order to do a direct comparison. We also looked at some of these specific practices that are very influential in terms of the scores for the erosion and soil quality concerns. And I guess I track back to some of the comments that Susan made about NRCS's approach, which is very practice-specific, and really thinking about those specific benefits of a practice on a particular piece of ground is, I think, a goal that is worth pursuing. The ability to tease out those specific practices inside of a cropping matrix in a specific geographical region is something that we really were not able to do with data mining. So Carmen showed you the questions that we were able to find enough data for that coverage. So this very site-specific performance is something that we might be able to do a better job with models. At this point, I think there is broad agreement that models work very well for a robust general statement, but we might need to calibrate them to get them to work regionally at a better, sort of more precise manner. And so we did some of that with our organic matter model, with that surrogate century model, using data from long-term studies separately from those that were used in the meta-analysis, and ran it for continuous corn, soybean, wheat, and corn, soybean, alfalfa rotations to look at the rotation effect. And then we looked at those with inorganic fertility, which is in the yellow and red, with conventional till and no-till with the circle and square. And then in the higher suite of lines, we have the manured plots with conventional and no-till modeled with those rotations. So we're looking at these very influential practices in CMT: rotation length, manure addition, and tillage. And I express the data here in the same way that the meta-analysis does, where we're looking at the relative magnitude of the effect, so rising above 1. And we see that here the century model's sort of core carbon thinking is not very sensitive to rotation length. That's unlike CMT. We don't have any increase across with time. The century model considers very much the mass of residues, and in our case, we rebuilt for each county historical yield data to drive the carbon inputs. And so you see what Carmen discussed, where the 2-year rotation, when it includes a low biomass crop like soybean, actually might perform less well than a continuous corn rotation. We see that possibly the model is considering interactions where we have a bigger difference between the conventional and no-till in the manured system. So maybe that nuance, which is something that I think if we're going to serve organic growers, we're going to really need to get much better at modeling complicated interactions between suites of practices. So I'm encouraged to see this difference in the magnitude of the response with interacting with fertility. So this is an area with interactions that I don't think we're quite at with meta-analysis, and if we work hard with the models, we might benefit greatly. We did with our framework, and I'm going to go really fast now, I apologize, but we looked at the effect on carbon sequestration with those models, and we see differences among regions. These are the listing of the states in the top, and we see differences in tillage practices, showing that really with our model, we're modeling field practices, and these are showing with the century piece, and we actually added erosion into our surrogate model, which isn't present in the main century, but we were able to consider erosion losses too, and we see that no-till is based on model predictions thought to perform better than the other possible practices, and so we have differences between the model and CMT here, and for that was for soil organic carbon. And this is for erosion. We have differences, again, with no-till performing better, and regional differences. We see big losses in the south, and we see possibly, I would speculate, maybe under-crediting the performance of some of these field practices that are maybe appreciated to a greater degree inside CMT. And soil conditioning index, which we would expect it to be similar to the organic matter model, is ranking things very similarly, and again, appreciating the benefits of no-till to a greater degree than these other partial tillage or practices that are parallel to the slope. So we see these comparisons. It's made obvious here where with CMT ranking, there's equal, for example, value for erosion with buffer strips in CMT, but using a process model inside the field bounds, we aren't picking that up with Russell. For the soil conditioning index, we're getting a pretty good agreement for many of our practices, but again, buffer strips and strip cropping, and the comparing them to the potential score. So when we're doing this kind of thing, we're thinking about how to use a blended approach for tool development for decision making. And I think that this is very important in a way because NRCS's choices will influence others developing sustainability standards. The Cool Farm tool is using a process model, for example, that's probably going to function similarly. The COMET model used for greenhouse gas registration is using a daily version of the Century model. So thinking about how to get these things to work right and to work for systems as diverse as organic systems is something at the sort of large level that is something we should seek to achieve. But at a more, I guess, maybe practical and immediate level, the organic farming standard and organic farmers, when they develop their organic systems plan, might use these tools immediately. I have a picture of the standards goals here on the bottom, and it's, I think, no coincidence. I think it's actually a direct connection between the goals articulated by organic to achieve stewardship of soil, water, and air, and protect soil biology and produce healthy foods that's led to that macro concerns that NRCS seeks to. So we have great parallel objectives between the two, so it would make sense that an individual farmer could use some version of the tool and even build that right into the development of their organic systems plan to help them speculate about benefits and make positive progress about these performance of their system. I'm going to really quick, this is an example of a CMT score for actual farms that we're working on, and the front row is the minimum threshold that needs to be exceeded in order to be considered successful for payment. And so these are from 2 different organic farms. So you can see that they aren't identical, but in general they're performing quite positively when really run through the score. We are looking at whether we could use these direct indicators or proxies, and so this is just a very preliminary of just a subset of the fields we're looking at to see whether the score was related to something we could directly predict and validate. So look for more of that down the road. And I would say summary points. We always, of course, would like more data to cover more complex systems. And I think that researchers can do a much better job by recording the specifics so that their data could be used in a very influential way into the future. I think we have to be aware of differences between scoring things and keep sort of an improving standard and a learning approach to these kinds of things, because this is something that we really want to do our best at. And I guess in terms of enabling people who are setting out to refine their systems for good stewardship, I think it would be wise to listen hard. So thinking about how we can help organic farmers use these tools, I think will help us get the science right. So with that, I think we should take some questions.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, we do have quite a few questions coming in, so if all the speakers want to unmute their microphones, that would be helpful. And I know we ran over time, so I just wanted to say before we start that for anyone who missed the beginning of the presentation, you can just use the question box on your screen to type in questions and hit return. And also, we do value your feedback, so if you would like to fill out our follow-up survey, which you'll be receiving in an email later today, we'd really appreciate that. Also, this webinar has been recorded, and you'll be able to find the link to it as well as some resources mentioned in the webinar, including these that are on your screen on our website, and I'll pull up that link so that you can see where you can find them after the webinar. The link is a little bit shorter. Let's see if I can get this up here. Whoops, I don't know what's happening. Let's see, oh, I just clicked on the link, that's why. 1 second. Okay, here we go. All right, so let's get to the questions. Let's see. Is there a way to get a printout of the eligible practices? Someone could address that.
Yes, I think one of the links in the last slide includes eligible practices, I believe, and if it's not there. We could add it to it.
Yeah, on that first link on this slide here, you can find the links to those resources, and this is kind of a shorter link to copy, that first one on the top there, so it might be a little bit easier because it's easier to have mistakes on those really long links. So might as well go here, and then you can get them directly. So there's a way to get a printout there.
And CSP actually has sort of two sets of evaluations. One is the benchmark scoring for what you're already doing, and then the other is enhancements, what you say you are willing to do that would go into the contract, and it would be an expectation that you would add. And I don't know for sure, although I think they are actually working this year to make those benchmark practices available on the web. I'm not sure if you can get them right now, but I do believe that the enhancement lists are published.
Okay.
That helps.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Susan. Okay, does your study suggest that organic systems are just as likely to lead to soil organic carbon as no-till?
Well, yes, and also you see that there is an increase if you look down in the profile. So the question would be, it depends on which depth you're looking at. So if you look in the shallow depths, you are likely to see similar carbon concentrations. But if you look deeper, even below the plow layer, you are likely to find more carbon in the organic systems than in non-till systems, based on our meta-analysis results.
Okay. This was another one for Carmen. On the SOC response, was this data normalized for the time of the farming practices?
Not exactly for the time. We didn't consider length of the studies. However, most of the data in terms of organic systems were already from systems that had been gone through the transition period and were already certified organic systems.
Okay, I guess this is a question, if I understand it correctly, about the study, how it's comparing organic and conventional systems. There's a comment that it would be helpful to separate conventional farming using cover crops, reduced tillage, and high diversity rotation. So I guess the question is, did your study do that?
We have information on that. However, like in the results you saw, you don't see any separation of that, and that's part due to the small number of pair comparisons that would meet our criteria. So we had to resort to just pull all the studies that were conventional separate. However, all the studies that were looking at conventional practices were monocultures that were using standard applications of nutrients and used pesticides as well.
If I could jump in here, the comparison where cover crops are compared to manure, to those combinations, you do see there the conventional with covers, and you can look at its sort of magnitude of benefit, and it's quite high. So, you know, our conventional was, and that control is defined as the fertilized without those conservation practices, but they are evaluated inside some of those specific comparisons, those, you know, conventional with conservation practices applied.
Okay, this goes back to the comparison of liquid fertilizer table, this grower is planning to use Neptune fish emulsion to fertilize hay crops and vegetable crops as a foliar spray. Did I see a lowering or poor performance of such fertilizer types on the chart?
We have seen, yeah, poor performance of I think in this case it was, I forget exactly what the source of the liquid manure was, but in general, we see that we could see, especially when there is not a lot of residue inputs, there will be negative performance in terms of carbon.
Yeah, I mean, fish emulsion is very different in both the quality and quantity you would use compared to the studies would be like a liquid hog manure kind of thing where I think the amounts would be radically different. So I would think that of fish emulsions as more like an inorganic fertilizer than a manure. You know, and think about them really providing you a pretty easy to apply, timely nutrient, you know, where you want it, but it wouldn't be applying a lot of organic matter.
Do you have any idea as to why the use of manure did not increase the SOC, especially in the case of the liquid manure?
Well, for it's a little hard to answer why, but like we think that also there is something to do with lower rates of application. So we have seen in long-term studies in Europe where that were used with high applications of manure. However, once the high applications have ceased, there was a rapid decline in carbon. So unfortunately, these studies didn't have the actual information on how much manure they applied. So we are speculating on some of the reasons that could be causing this effect.
If I could add to that, you know, we're looking at that sort of both the CMT and the process models give such a high benefit, and when we look back to where some of those expectations come from, they're heavily influenced by some of the very old long-term studies that that we did not include because they don't have, for example, the morphplots aren't replicated. And as Carmen said, I think the sort of modern composition of manures and rates, in a lot of those studies, you really start to see people not getting the similar kinds of increases that were achieved in those older data sets.
Okay. Would wet manures include the filtered digested discharge from a methane digester? Would that fall into that category?
We don't have data included from those, but I think you could look at the quality, and probably they're probably more like that. And it's a great question, and we should probably class these things about, you know, nutrient density, moisture, salt content, and really think about them. So those things that are a high salt concentration and high ammonium concentration and largely, you know, a lot of water would probably act more alike. Although some of those materials, I don't know what their moisture content is, but that's the way I'd attack it.
Do you have any data on how many organic farmers have used CSP?
Probably in the records of NRCS, I'm sure that. However, in our study, we looked at specific counties, so it's hard to say how many organic farmers are enrolled nationwide.
This is Sarah Brown. That information has been collected, and I believe that the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has that information available on their website. If not, you can feel free to contact either NSAC, who I just mentioned, or myself, and we should be able to get that information for you.
Okay, here's a question about whether if process models have a pretty wide range of statistically confident prediction, is there a problem with using them when trying to validate the CMT?
So I think that there's some really nice work showing how they work really well, making a generalization for the nation. But if you then apply them to a specific county or field, the variability in precision or reliability drops to 200% uncertainty. So in order to make them more robust for an individual location, I think many people are working on ways to better initialize them or calibrate them so that you get a better number. Although for the types of farming systems that we have enough data in the can to do that kind of calibration are limited and more constrained to the more dominant conventional systems. And I think a lot of, we may not have the data we would like to do that for some of our more complicated farming systems. At least that's a conclusion that's been made by people working on some of these carbon trading efforts that have used a similar approach to literature mining to try to come up with carbon sequestration rates for different systems. And this deficiency in data covering very diverse systems has been noted as a problem limiting that.
Okay, here's a question for you, Michelle. Why do you think that cover crops show a greater impact on soil organic matter than manure or compost? This questioner has always assumed that less cover crop carbon is retained in the soil than with manure or compost.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think that the data that we have, in a way, I think of it separately, where the cover crops are very successful, and I think that shows up, I've always been very convinced of, I think it's partially the contact of the roots with the soils and the ability to stabilize it, and it's a carbon-rich substrate that I think helps really promote aggregate stabilization and maybe a more lasting benefit than just the compost. And I think that, I guess, we were raised up on the idea that manures and compost had a more stable component, and now in the organic matter world, I think people are really attacking that idea of inherent recalcitrance as something that's not really so true. And so I think that thinking about the amount of carbon you put in and then the ability of that carbon to interact with the soil. So I think having the covers there through the winter, protecting the soil from things that degrade it, and adding the carbon are two of the reasons that practice is so important. And I think we're getting the similar benefit in longer rotations that have small grains, and cover the soil a longer period of time.
Okay, here's a comment. Aren't we supposed to be calling our congressman today because they're deciding the fate of the now unfunded Beginning Farmer and Rancher program and other beginning farmer programs in the Farm Bill, since they should be talking about this today on Capitol Hill. Anybody wants to comment on that?
This is Sarah Brown. I know that there have been some issues with CST funding, and the National Sustainable Ag Coalition has more information on their website about that.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. I know we have a few more questions here. How can we practically measure soil quality indicators in conservation programs at the farm level?
Well, I think, and maybe Susan wants to take this on, but I think we see new interest in NRCS through the dynamic properties efforts to get the kind of broad coverage that would allow an individual to take a farm level measure and have a comparative metric behind it. I don't know, Susan, did I put you on the spot to talk more about that?
Yeah, no, I'm not on the spot at all. Actually, we are working on what I'm calling the Rapid Assessment Tool, or the RAT, that will be what our field staff will be able to use with farmers, or potentially farmers on their own, that based on a small number of questions will tell you the best simple indicators to measure for what ails you, basically. So you don't need a hammer to screw in a screw, kind of an idea. So it asks you, what are you trying to do? Well, I'm trying to screw something in. Well, use a screwdriver is the analogy. We're thinking about 3 to 5 indicators, both observational and field measurements, and we'll also have sort of a question at the beginning for experience level. So if you're working with one of our resource soil scientists who is more has more technical training with soil measurements, then there will be some somewhat more complicated things that will have to be taken back to the office to finish up. If you check that I'm a lay person, then there might be just observational measures like the old soil health card. We'll also have an option that will say, I want an overall soil health assessment, as opposed to, just looking at one function or 2 functions. And with that, you'll need to choose an indicator that's representative or a proxy for each of the functions, like soil stability, filtering and buffering, water movement, nutrient cycling. So that's how that'll work. Okay. And we're actively working on it, and hope to have at least be in the beta testing stage by the end of the fiscal year, which is the end of September.
Okay, I think we have time for a last question here. For a given farming practice, is the increase in soil carbon or soil organic matter over time linear?
For soil carbon?
Yeah, yes. For the soil carbon or soil organic matter, is it linear?
No,
no. Go ahead.
Okay.
For a short period, it is. Michelle, were you going to answer that? Go ahead.
I was, but I didn't know whether you were comment. I mean, I think the person asking the question probably knows this too. Your ability to increase carbon is very influenced by the initial condition of the soil, and soils will saturate at different levels dependent upon texture. So really, this is why the models need to be informed before you start, so you can rebuild the history and then have this idea of a baseline about your existing condition and then predict whether they will change. And so if the soil's in very bad shape and you introduce in a grading practice, its rate of change will be more rapid and have a bigger percent change, and then it'll plateau. And using, and it's kind of interesting, the organic transition, within 3 years in some of these active fractions of organic matter, you can see a really notable change with use of organic practices or introduction of cover crops when the soil has been under a low-level baseline management. But if it's coming out of pasture, you might even lose organic carbon if you put it into cover crops and no-till.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time here, so I'd like to thank everyone for their questions and mention once again that you can find this recording within the coming week, as well as recordings of our many other recorded presentations, including several others on EQIP and NRCS conservation practices, at the link on your screen. And we'd very much appreciate it if you could fill out our follow-up survey that you'll be receiving in an email later today. So thank you again, Susan, Michelle, Carmen, and also Sarah for giving this presentation and answering questions. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.